First, thanks for the invitation to teach. It's really a delight to be here, see people in person and some people that I see on the screen. My sort of late career connection with Beth Israel has been really lovely for me, really kind of a sweet way to kind of slide into retirement in an easy way. So thank you, and it's good to see everybody. As I was going over my notes the last couple of days, I looked at the title and I thought, wow, that's a really interesting title. That's a provocative title. Gosh, I wonder how he's going to do that. So maybe I'll start, not quite an apology, but just I want to set some ground rules or some parameters right away. So what I don't want to do is just engage in a political debate about critical race theory or cancel culture. I'm really interested in how these things are being perceived in the broader culture, why they become so controversial. You know, what is it about them that that stirs up so much discourse back and forth? And also just, there are elements in both, mostly in critical race theory, at least the way it's understood in the broader culture, that connects to these holidays, to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that's what I'm going to look at. And what I've come to, and obviously I'm not the last word on this, and I'd like to hear from some of you, but the stirrings, you know, and the cultural thunder that accompanies these things, critical race theory in particular, is a discussion about memory, about remembering. So it's specifically, it's about remembering our past. And here I mean our culture's past, but also, I'm going to come back to this all the time, remembering ourselves as individuals. But it's remembering in order to tell a story. So really the controversies about this, I would boil them down to, how do you tell the story? How do you remember and then take pieces of those memories, privilege some, throw out others, and tell a story? So the story could be about America, could be about Israel, and really importantly, could be about ourselves, my story. How do I tell that story? And it turns out that's a tricky business. Now, my own personal interest in this comes from another late career choice I made to teach in a high school. And most of you know, I mean, critical race theory really entered mainstream controversy when there's issues in schools. How are schools handling it? How are school boards handling it? And really, again, it's the same controversy. How do we tell our stories? Why do we tell our stories certain ways? How do we teach history? And I'm going to introduce now, and I'm going to come back to this several times. There's a dialectic I'm going to be playing with. It's not the only dialectic. A dialectic, a dichotomy, it's two ideas that stand in tension. And what we want to do is kind of figure out, in some ways, how to harmonize them, or maybe they stay in tension. But the dialectic is, do we tell our story, do we remember, because our goal is a reckoning? So if it's a reckoning, then I've got to remember everything. I mean, in fact, if it's a reckoning, I have to privilege the very worst things about myself, about my culture. Because there's no way you can do a reckoning without it. Is that the point? Or is the point renewal? Renewal is very different. Renewal is that, well, what happened in the past kind of stays in the past. I bring it up a little bit, you know, and I have to focus, I have to engage on some of it, but really, if the purpose is renewal, sorry, I just have to. If the purpose is renewal, then I have a lot more freedom to privilege this memory and not this memory. Keep this at the center and throw away that. Because if the purpose is renewal, the purpose is really to build up confidence for the next year and make myself a better person. But if the purpose is reckoning, then you know you're out there in front of God. Our culture is out there in front of our children, and we have to see what we've really done and reckon with it. Okay, so that's my introduction. What I want to do is look at some text. So I'm going to look at some Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur prayers. So people that are here, you have that in front of you. The first thing, I'll share the screen in a second. Before we even look at it, I'll say there's a number of ways of looking at how the High Holiday Prayer Book, the Machzor, deals with these issues of memory, because it does. It's a very, very important theme. So one thing you could say is, It's confusing because the points of view are all over the place and sometimes seem to contradict each other. Or you could say it's pluralistic. It's just all sorts of different ideas that are invited and we pick and choose. I mean, I think what we'd like to say is that there's a kind of harmony, that in the tension, we can discover a way to synthesize the different ideas to become useful for us. So keep all those things in mind, and we'll look at Unetana Tokef. Those of you that were here for my last Torah study, it seems like weeks ago, but it was just a few days ago, I looked at Unetana Tokef, but we'll look at it again. I would say this is the second most important traditional prayer. The first most important we'll get to. And what I'm going to look at is the traditional Unetana Tokef, translated as best that I could find on Safari, which is a great website. So let's take a look at that, see if this works for share screen. All right. It's a little weird how it comes out on the screen. I'm not sure if people at home can see it this way. Suddenly it's like this stark black and white. It's like white fire and black fire. I don't know if I can get rid of this. Well, all right, we'll do the best we can. I'm going to read it. We lend power to the holiness of this day, for it is tremendous and awe-filled. And on it your kingship will be exalted, and your throne will be established in loving kindness, and you will sit on that throne in truth. The word truth is going to repeat itself, or truth. It is true that you are the one who judges and reproves, who knows all, and bears witnesses. So now, I tried to bold it. Those of you here, you can see it's bolded. And it's harder to see at home, but I'll point it out. So we're standing before God. What does God do? Who inscribes and seals, who reckons and enumerates. You remember all that is forgotten. You open the book of records, and from it all shall be read. So first of all, I don't know if you came across this in Hebrew school or your Jewish education. We got this book. You know, there's a book that has all my deeds in it. And if it's got all my deeds in it, it's inclusive. It's got everything. Maybe the first chapter are the very worst things I did, because what are you trying to do in Yom Kippur? Surface those really bad things that you did so you can get forgiveness. So there's a book. Right? But there's this idea too. I'm standing before God, and God. So if it's not me that's writing the book, it's God that's writing the book. In some ways that's even worse, because it says here, you remember all that is forgotten. If I'm writing my book, there's plenty I'm going to forget. It's a lot that I want to forget. And there's a lot that I'll just forget. But it doesn't say that. If God writes the book, everything's in there. So at that point, that's a full reckoning. What you want to ask yourself is, this is a spiritual moment. Right? I mean, it talks about standing before God. I mean, if we go on a little bit, you can see that angels are panicked about it. And then we have this, as a shepherd, if you see that, as a shepherd herds his flock, directing his sheep to pass under his staff, so do you shall pass, count, and record. That Hebrew word record, poked, also really means remember. So that's me in the parentheses there, the souls of all living. There's this moment. We stand before God as an individual, because each individual sheep passed before the shepherd. What does God do? Remember everything that I forgot. So this is a reckoning. Everything is there. You know, we were talking earlier about how one of the issues in Zoom is that we don't like watching ourselves. Right? I mean, I teach teenagers, they hate looking at themselves. I mean, so teenagers, we had a rule in our school that you have to have your camera on, because otherwise you can't mark them present or not. So what a lot of teenagers would do, they'd hide. So you could just see their eyes. Because they didn't want people to see them. They didn't want to look at themselves. So imagine, so Yom Kippur, that's Yom Kippur, and Rosh Hashanah, you're standing fully before God. It's the worst possible mirror. Because God sees everything. So it's in the service. So our Unetana Tokef is a prayer of reckoning. You want to tell the story? Tell the whole story. Now we could look at this as the American story, the Israel story, but here it's about individuals also. It's my story. Okay. And that's, an interesting move. It's definitely there. But what we'll find is that in the High Holiday Prayer Book, we have also exactly the opposite. So I'm going to go on. So I said, Unetana Tokef is maybe the second most important, maybe the second most famous prayer. It goes on to the famous part, who shall live, who shall die. I'm less interested in that right now. You have it there. On Rosh Hashanah, it is inscribed, and Yom Kippur it is sealed. How many shall pass away, how many shall be born, who shall live, who shall die, etc. But I'm more interested in those earlier paragraphs, which is that moment you're standing before God in that full reckoning, that full mirror from hell, where you have to look at yourself and see. Okay. But now, I'd say the most famous prayer is called Nidre. Now, part of that was an interesting prayer. Part of that is a famous melody. You know, which my kids could hum when they were like 2 years old. I don't think they understood the words too much. I'm not sure I understand the words too much. It's in Aramaic. So you know, all the fluent Aramaic speakers get it right away. but a lot of them aren't around anymore. So, but what I'm interested in is again, the spiritual moment, the mood here. All vows and things we had made forbidden for ourselves, and oaths and items we had consecrated to the temple. Issue with the expression konam. Konam was like just the language of an oath. And vows which are abbreviated, and vows issue with the expression kanos, just another way of saying I swear. That we have vowed and sworn and dedicated and made forbidden upon ourselves from this Yom Kippur until next Yom Kippur. They come to us at a good time. We regret having made them. That's interesting too. I mean, it's an expression of regret. May they all be permitted, forgiven, eradicated, and nullified. May they not be valid or exist any longer. This is exactly the opposite mood. First of all, I mean, it's very clear the vows are metaphors for our traumatic past of the past year. All those horrible stories. The horrible things that we remember or that we did to other people at the very beginning of Yom Kippur. In our most famous prayer, we say, those are in the past. That was then and this is now. Not interested. I mean, it's like the Tashlik service. The Tashlik service, you take it, it's out of the ocean. It's gone. And it's not coming back. It's the opposite of when I talk about. I'm not spending time with a reckoning. How am I gonna fix everything that I broke? I'm actually saying, look, I made some mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm throwing those mistakes in the ocean. They're absolved. They don't mean anything anymore. Why? Because the aim here is renewal. I want to face that new year with a full sense of power and confidence. And that Unatana Tokef moment, that's not going to do it for me. That's going to depress me. But the Kol Nidre moment, I can move on. And that's my goal here. Here it's to move on. All right, a few more prayers. Those are the big two. I mean, it's the two most famous prayers, and they have opposite moods. Just think about that. Let's do a little bit more. We'll see if there's any questions or comments. Yeah, so this is also pretty famous. Sometimes things become famous because they're nice melodies and people write for them. But also I think we should take seriously the words. So this is a common phrase throughout the High Holiday Prayer Book. Remember us for life, O King who desires life. So the first word to remember is Achrenu. So we're saying, God, we want you to remember who we are. Remember us. But right away there's a hesitation. Don't remember everything about us. Right? Remember us for life. But that's Achrenu l'chaim, because you want us to be alive. And write us in the book of life. What I want you to do, God, what I'm insisting that you do, is remember the good things about me. There's a lot of bad things, but I'm not asking you to remember those. Remember those things are gonna give me a good year, a good judgment. And I want to say, I think I should stress this over and over again. If we're talking to God, in my mind, we're also talking to ourselves. What do I want to remember? I want to remember the good things. So Achrenu l'chaim. Because that's what I need in order to move forward. Okay, so one thing that happened, so I'm teaching high school now, one thing that happened in May, the latest Gaza war, is that we had a faculty meeting. A lot of students were asking, I teach at the San Diego Jewish Academy, so it's a Jewish school. And so we had a faculty meeting because a lot of teachers, I mean, some of them weren't Jewish, didn't know very much. Even the Jews didn't know what to say. So we sort of gathered together. And how are we going to talk about this? And how we're going to talk about it is really, how are we going to tell the story? How do we tell the story of Israel? We had a really interesting discussion. I mean, some of it was just the horrors that had led to that, to the eruption of hostilities, and back and forth. And one teacher, you know, one teacher who's been through these discussions before, but had an urgent question for me, was just, you know, what are we? You know, are we educators? Because if we're educators, then you need to teach the full truth. You know, let the chips fall where they may. There's going to be good, there's going to be bad. It's a reckoning. I mean, really, teaching history should be a kind of reckoning, so you get a full sense of the mistakes, the sins, the traumas, and of course the good things. Or are we cheerleaders? You know, because we're a Jewish school. We have relationships with Israel. Are we propagandists? But that's what I want you to, says it to me, that's what I want you to answer. Well, who are we? Are we educators or are we propagandists? And for me, I wasn't sure. I mean, this is the problem with me. Yeah, I can always see it both ways. I mean, obviously I'm inclined to say that we're educators and we're teaching the full truth, but this is a Jewish school. There's a need for cheerleading. When I say, are we cheerleaders, I'm not dismissing it. I've been a cheerleader my whole life for Israel. Propagandist, I'm not comfortable with that. That's still a good question. You in the classroom, as you're telling the story of the Jewish people, you're telling the story of Israel. What are you focusing on? How are you telling the story? And what comes first in the telling? If you think about that particular war. I mean, do you start that story with 1948? Do you start the story with 1967? Does it start when there were 4 or 5 families in a Palestinian neighborhood in Israel who were in danger of losing their homes? Or do you start it with the Holocaust, you know, and Jews in desperate condition? I'm not saying, I wasn't sure. How do you give a full context, and what's the purpose of that full context? So it gets us back to, again, the controversy is, how do you remember, and how do you tell the story? Okay, I'm going to read you one more. I didn't put this on the study sheet, but I'm going to read you one more. There's a whole section in Rosh Hashanah. It's later in the day in traditional services, so a lot of people miss it. But as a rabbi, I had to be there. But it's in Hebrew, it's called Zichronot. Zichronot just means memories. So this is the memories or the remembering section of the Rosh Hashanah service. And this is a full, it's really interesting to read it. It's a full revision of history. It's in full cheerleader mode. Really, I mean, it's just because, so there's one, so it quotes a lot of ways that God remembers us. So there's this quote from Jeremiah, and it goes like this: "Thus said God," and God here is speaking to the entire Jewish people. "I remember the affection of your youth, your love when we were betrothed, when you followed me in the wilderness, a barren land." So Jeremiah is saying, here's what God remembers. You people, you were married to God. You were like a young bride with a young groom. I remember those wonderful days, you know, the first year of marriage where there was no conflict and it was our honeymoon. You know, you're reading this and you're thinking, that's not how I remember the 40 years of the desert. But the 40 years of the desert was one sin after another, God trying to destroy the people, one after another. If we just read like the book of Deuteronomy, we'll look at it in a second, or the book of Numbers, it doesn't read like that. It doesn't seem like that's a honeymoon couple, God in the desert with the people. But this is Rosh Hashanah. And Rosh Hashanah, we want to focus on, let's remember those honeymoon times. Now, in some ways, it's not a bad approach to couples therapy. You know, a lot has developed over the years that maybe we should bring up and remember, a lot of traumas. But we want to ask ourselves, what's the purpose? Is it a reckoning, you know, with a cost? Or is our goal renewal, you know, to move on? So what do we remember, and what's our goal in remembering? There's a few others, but that's the point of this. Is every verse here that's quoted is God remembering us and loving us. Okay, but you know, I'll throw out again the tension. The Unetana Tokef, which is very powerful, is standing before God, and it's a reckoning. It's remembering everything. The Kol Nidre pulls back on that and says, no, there's things we could just throw out, like the bread at Tashlich, and then there's the remember us for life. Okay, I'm going to stop here. We're going to look at now some text from the broader tradition that will help us maybe synthesize these ideas. But any comments or questions up to now? Joe?
Yeah, when
Can they hear everybody? Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Probably have to speak loudly, but that's not a problem for you and I, right?
when I teach cultural anthropology and looking at telling the story, I like to begin with Ayan Hirsi Ali's book Infidel, Because on the first thing is, how do you tell the story? She's under a tree with her grandmother, and she's remembering 500 years back in her ancestry at the age of 6. That telling the story is so foreign to us that it really raises the problem of understanding of what the metric actually is. It's not the answer, but it raises the problem. I want to situate the students in that problem.
I mean, what's good about that is every culture has to make these decisions. And that's the difficult too. And every Rosh Hashanah, every Yom Kippur, we have to make those decisions also. You know, we have to go through that, you know, what am I trying to do here? You know, is it full reckoning, or am I trying to build myself up with a sense of renewal? And every culture ultimately makes that decision. Now, I'll add one thing. I was going to say that Judaism is obsessed with storytelling, but that's probably true of all cultures, right? I mean, every culture has its story. What may be unique about Judaism is the various ways we come to tell our story. When you think of our most important holidays, Yom Kippur, obviously a storytelling holiday. It's mostly focused on the individual. Pesach is the great communal telling stories. You got to stay up all night and tell the story. So cultures have these, and the whole critical race theory. To me, the reason it's created so much havoc is that we all care about how we tell our stories. We're implicated. Yes.
I'm not sure how to reconcile your description of the tension as opposed to your language of or, which seems more black and white rather than a continuum. So I'm wondering what to do with that.
Yeah, thank you. Rabbi Stein, I didn't recognize you. I don't think we've met each other in person. We meet once a week on Zoom, but it shows the issue. But I'll say that you're much better looking in person. You were very good looking before, but I seem to throw that out. As long as we were talking about mirrors and things like that too. I think like the or, I guess I'm starting with or. I want to get to a kind of synthesis of the two ideas. The thing is that the difference is so stark. Like the mood is so stark. And clearly, whoever wrote Kol Nidre is not the same person who wrote the Unetana Tokef. And maybe they just have different ideas, so maybe we just leave it at that. But we have it in the prayer book. And in some ways, I think we're meant to put the two together in some way. So I want to get to that. There's a reading from Ramban, Nachmanides, that makes the most sense to me. So we'll get to that. But yeah, I mean, I think is there a way, I can make it an and. Instead of an or.
Rabbi, the Lazaros on the screen have a question as well.
Okay, please. The Lazaros. You have to unmute.
Yeah. Hi. When you're talking about memory so much, it reminds me of the admonition to forget Amalek, remember to forget Amalek. And playing with memory and deciding to forget something. Are we asking God to forget some of our places where we've fallen short?
I mean, that's a great comment. We're actually going to look at those verses about Amalek and about remembering to forget. So maybe just hold off on that, and then we'll come back to you. Let's take one more comment now, and then I'll look at, yes, please.
I was surprised that you said that it was clear, as if it's not controversial, that Kol Nidre and the vows were stand-ins for past transgressions. When I think of them, I see the renewal tone, but I think of them as forward-looking and kind of bucking yourself up to be your best person during this 24 hours. Is that in fact the notion that it really is backward-looking and things that then kind of understood and uncontroversial?
Most of the sources that I've read describe it that way. The vows being stand-ins, metaphors for poor behavior, for trauma in the past year. So it's a way like Tashlich, just to move forward, like throwing your sins in the ocean. I don't think that we dwell enough on how radical that prayer is. That's why I wanted to mention it too. I mean, what do you mean? I mean, all our vows, why am I taking vows? I mean, what an incredible thing to say. Nothing matters. Everything I promised from last year doesn't matter anymore. But there's this need to say that because I so crave starting over. And Yom Kippur is this amazing gift, the high holidays too, where I can start over. So we start with this bold, radical statement that a lot of it, I'll get to this in the end, is just, we're imploring God, we are so frail. You know, we make so many mistakes. There's so many statements and that we make an error. Just forget it, okay? Just give me another chance. Let's move those into the past. That was then, this is now. And I think that's an accurate telling of the mood of Kol Nidre. Okay.
Rabbi,
Yes.
Can I ask you something? You were mentioning about teaching at SDJA and asking yourself if you're being an educator or perhaps there's propaganda somehow in there. So my question as a follow-up on that is, if you were to picture yourself teaching somewhere else, let's say in a secular classroom, do you think that you might change your messaging, or do you think that it would stay the same?
So my messaging would probably stay the same, but the school, whatever school it might have a different approach. If I'm speaking in front of any audience, I have to ask myself that. What is my role here in talking about Israel? Am I just giving information, or am I really trying to push a point of view? And I'd have to go through that in my mind, but the school, they'd have their own, different schools would have their own preferences. Okay. Yeah.
Is there a big difference in how you would present as an educator in the full picture of Israel and being a supporter or a proponent?
That's the $1 million question.
Huh?
That's the $1 million question. Is there a way, again, I mean, is there a way of combining a reckoning with the kind of renewal? And so let's go to the further text, and then we can talk about how I think the book of Deuteronomy does it, one commentary. So if there's one book, if there's one book in the Torah, if there's one Jewish book that's obsessed with storytelling, one would be, of course, Pesach, right, where it's called the Haggadah. And the word Haggadah means the storytelling. So the name of the book is storytelling. But I would say the book of the Torah, the Bible, the Tanakh, that most focuses on storytelling is Deuteronomy. Because Deuteronomy is Moses telling the story. So the people are about to enter the land of Israel after 38 years in the desert, wandering 40 years plus 2, minus 2, because 2 was was the first 2 years. But it's 40 altogether. And the people are about to cross the Jordan. That's that major transition. Life is going to be different now because you're going to cross the Jordan. And Moses has a story to tell them. And that's in almost the entire book of Deuteronomy, is that story that Moses tells them. So what's interesting about it, I'll share the screen. So the first thing, basically the first story that Moses tells them, he gathers everybody together. Tomorrow we're conquering the land. You want to think about what Moses is trying to accomplish. I'm not sure, but you might want to think about that. The first thing he does is tell their worst moment. The worst moment was the story of the spies. You might say that the worst moment is the golden calf, so he can start with the golden calf. He gets to the golden calf, but he starts with the story of the spies. The story of the spies, briefly, is when the people, they make it to the land of Israel after 2 years, and God says, okay, conquer it, and they decide not to. They decide we can't do it. Because the spies go and they tell them that the Canaanites are too great, we can't do it. So the entire project, Moses' whole life, it's worse than the golden calf. In some ways I would say it's worse than worshiping an idol. Because what do you think this whole purpose was to conquer the land of Israel, and God's bringing you to the land of milk and honey. The whole purpose of liberation is to come to the land, and when you get to the Jordan, they say no. Let's go back to Egypt. Moses starts with that. You have to why are you starting with the worst moment? What are you trying to do with these people? I'm not giving an answer, but right here we have that sense of reckoning. But it gets confusing. Like I said, we have to learn how to synthesize these things. Is the next thing he decides to talk about is the military victory. So this is Deuteronomy 3, 1 through 3. We made our way up the road toward Bashan, and King Og of Bashan with all his men took the field against us at Edrei. But the Lord said to me, do not fear him, for I am delivering him and all his men and this country into your power, and you will do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived in Heshbon. So the Lord our God also delivered into our power King Og of Bashan with all his men, and we dealt with them such a blow that no survivor was left. This actually, now Moses is boasting. The next story he decides to tell us, remember when we just kick the stuffing out of Og and Sihon, and we just wiped them out. Remember that. So it's not like Moses sticks to the spy story and the trauma and the sin and the mistakes. Now, my siblings and I always had a joke about this. This Moses reminding the people about this victory, it's about 10 times. And I was thinking, like, Moses gets a lot of mileage out of that. he's got to find that one time that they won. And he wants to remind them. So that seems more like, okay, a renewal. What we're looking for is a renewal. We're not looking for reckoning. You wonder why he starts with that story about the spies, which is going to just depress everybody. You know, it's going over, God was so mad at you, you know, and I was so mad at you because ultimately God said I couldn't enter the promised land. That's how he starts. But he comes back to this Og and Sihon, and remember that you are strong and that you can do this. Okay. Now let's get to time for more questions. What Jane already reminded us of. I think the key text in all of this is my bar mitzvah maftir. Because it's my bar mitzvah maftir, it's the key text in everything. It's the most, it's automatically the most important. But I actually think, because it's called Shabbat Zachor. I read it on Shabbat Zachor. And Zachor means remember. And it's this paragraph. It's the paragraph about Amalek. Amalek to me here, just as vows are kind of stand-in for sins, Amalek is a stand-in for trauma.
For what?
Trauma. So Amalek was that terrible war where they tried to wipe us out, and we suffered, and we lost. So now Moses finally gets to the Amalek. And here it's very confusing, and I think there's instruction in the confusion. Remember what Amalek did to you on the journey. Everybody with me? Yeah. So it's Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19. After you left Egypt. Now, undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you in the march, when you were famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Remember this, Moses is saying. This is important. Remember the horror of it. Because it wasn't just the soldiers. Now Amalek and stuck around the back and killed the women and children. Therefore, when the Lord, your God, grants you safety from all your enemies around you. In other words, when you cross over and you live a new life. New is important there. Right? It's not going to be the old ways. You're not wandering in the desert anymore. When you cross over and everything is new, in the land that the Lord God is giving you, as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. So he's telling you the story. He says, what I want you to do is blot out the memory. In other words, what I want you to do is forget your traumas. But the way I'm telling you, remember to forget. Do not forget. Remember to forget. It's, you know, we talked about before. That's a key paradox. You can't remember to forget. Because as soon as you're remembering, you're not forgetting. So we have a lot of commentary on that. How do you remember to forget? It's hinting at something really profound, though. Again, how do we internalize our traumas? Do we just erase them? Like throwing the bread out there? How do we internalize our traumas as a nation? The Civil War, you know, Thomas Jefferson being a slave, but how do we internalize those things? All the trauma, how do we internalize the Holocaust? And it's giving us this paradox. Remember to forget. So remember it, but remember so you can forget. Now, I'm not going to go through all the commentary. I'm just going to look at one, which I think I did with some of you when we had this Torah reading. So this is Ramban, Nachmanides. Nachmanides is not the most famous commentary. I think in some ways the most intellectually profound. So first he spent some time trying to figure out what it means to remember to forget, which it's a paradox, so you can't. So then he comes up with, and I have it in bold. Here we go. The correct interpretation appears to me that the verse states that you are not to forget what Amalek did to us until we blot out his remembrance from under the heavens, and that we are to relate it to our children and to our generations, saying to them, thus did the wicked one do to us, and therefore we have been commanded to blot out his name. Similarly, and that gets to the heart of it. So this is about, like, how do we look at our ancestors, even when they sin? Does it stain everything they've done from then on? I'm using this as the Thomas Jefferson case, not because I have anything against Thomas Jefferson, but it's something you hear in our current debates. You know, if Abraham Lincoln was actually a bigot, what do we do with that? So how do we tell his story? And why would we be telling his story to begin with? So Ramban picks Miriam. Similarly, in the affair of Miriam, We are commanded to make it known to our children and relate it to the generations. This is Miriam slandering about her brother, complaining that her brother married a non-Jew and continuing to slander him. So he's saying we have to remember that. I'll just keep going. Although it would have been appropriate to conceal it in order not to speak of the shortcomings of the righteous. It would have been like, it's just better not to talk about it. This is fascination. Like what? It's not something we want to remember. It's an unpleasant episode. Why would you want to tell that story? It's something that we have to do. It would have been appropriate not to conceal it in order not to speak of the shortcomings of the righteous. Yet Scripture commanded that it be made known and revealed so that the admonition against slander be put in their mouths. Remember what she did? Because it is a great sin. It causes many evils, and people are in the habit of stumbling therein. Just as the rabbis have said, all people are suspect of a shade of slander. I'm saying it's uncomfortable to remember those things about her. But we have to remember them, because we have to focus on that sin so we can get better. What's interesting about Nachmanides, and I hear, we get to this kind of an attempt, at least at a synthesis, is that, so he's saying that it might be better, if we all just held hands and celebrated Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and everybody. It might build us up as a country. But in many ways, that's a pessimistic approach. Because if you're doing that, you're basically saying we can never get better. What I like about Nachmanides is that it takes a detour into fully negative territory, remembering our sins, remembering our traumas, but with an optimistic spirit. So we have the strength to remember the terrible things she did for a purpose, so that we can improve. We can all improve. We can learn that slander is bad, because that's what she did. So tell her story. That's what he gets at about Zachor. For him, Zachor is, so he's sort of in the direction of a full reckoning. But he says renewal is not possible without the full reckoning. And that's his great synthesis. We have to tell the story of Thomas Jefferson having slaves. If Abraham Lincoln was a bigot, we have to tell that story. But we tell it with the optimistic spirit that now we're able to improve. It seems to me that has been what's great about America. Is that America, up until our current political rhetoric, there was this optimism to America that we can be better because we tell stories fearlessly. And I feel like that's an optimism that's in the Matzor, and certainly in the way we can tell the stories about Israel. It's a good model. I'll tell you one other quick story. There's a few other verses here, which we don't have to go over in detail. It's really, I'll mention it, then I'll tell you my story. So the next several texts talk about, we'll take a look at it. So it's Deuteronomy 12, 2 through 4. I want to bring this in, even though it's sort of out of context, but it's an important mood to keep in mind as we're discussing these issues. You must destroy all the sites in which the nations you are to dispossess worship their gods, whether on lofty mountains and on hills or under any luxuriant tree. When you come into Israel, destroy everything that came before you. Now, I mentioned this before in a different group that in some ways the Canaanites represent what the Israelites used to be, the past of the Israelites. And now God is saying, Moses is saying, when you get to Israel, erase that past. So there is this urge in Deuteronomy to start anew, to forget the past, wipe out the past, destroy the past. I mean, this reminds me a little bit of the just smashing down statues. And let's just get rid of those things. We don't have to think about them so they're not on our face anymore. Actually, you have that mood here. And it's so pronounced. It's this back and forth. There's such an urge that when the people cross the river, they start anew, that Moses has to die.
Rabbi Graubart, can you your screen is not sharing. We're still back on Deuteronomy 3.
All right, thank you. That's weird because it's not moving?
It's not moving. We haven't seen the last several texts.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sharing.
All right, what I'll do is let's try stop share. Oh, yeah, I just lost everything. Can anybody see me? Well, you all can see.
That's a subliminal message.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
We see the room beautifully.
I see, you don't see me.
Oh, sure, they're right in the.
We see you. It's focused on you.
Okay. Well, maybe what I'll do is I'm almost done.
Okay, well. Well, this is fun. Okay. Everyone at home can still see us on camera?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I can't see you, which frankly is better. No, not,
This is all about the mirrors we were talking
I
about.
know, exactly, no, it's just, fewer distractions, so, let's see, yeah. So, I was at the point where there is the urge, and I guess this touches something that's really important and you can't ignore. The urge for renewal is so great in the book of Deuteronomy that Moses has to die. We can't have any remnant of the past. Everything has to be brand new. And to me, I mean, we have to give some honor to that. Certainly, like the reckoning is important. And like we talked about Miriam, to tell Miriam's story, because the reckoning is important, but I have that incredible urge for renewal. And that wins out. I mean, it ends up killing Moses. All right. This is something that a friend and colleague used to call me every year, and many of you have met him before, Rabbi Jack Reamer, who was a rabbi in San Diego. And he told me that what we're looking for in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is a remembering. So we remember what we need to remember, but we're also looking for a forgetting. You know, there's certain things we do need to leave behind and move on from. So every year he would call me up, and on Rosh Hashanah he would say, I wish you a good remembering. Remember what you need to remember, and I wish you a good forgetting, because there's things that you need to forget. And ultimately, I think he got the synthesis too. The thing is that you can't get to the renewal without a full reckoning. Like somewhere you can't just ignore it. You can't throw out all that bread. I mean, you need it needs to surface. But if it's just wiping out the past, then that's a kind of moral idiocy. You know, where you're not even trying to get better. So I think he synthesizes that one speaks to the other. And the reckoning is important because it leads to renewal, but you can't do the renewal without the reckoning. All right, let's take questions, comments.
If there's any questions in the chat, I have it up here.
Oh, so it's working on you?
It's working on my phone. I would say to stop it and restart it, but it's just too risky.
Yeah. Well, let's see, are there any questions or comments here? Yeah.
We're looking at the history as a uniform series of events and times, but it's disrupted, and people want to focus on certain parts of the past and whether there's renewal or redemption at different junctures. And so that these continuities, I think, adds into some of the chaos in terms of what you grab hold of in terms of that explanation.
Yeah, I think that's important to say. Part of also, remember I said like there's two choices as a teacher. You know, are you an educator or are you the cheerleader, the propagandist? I mean, there's the third option is that are you just someone who tells the truth? You just tell the whole truth. The problem with that is that it still depends on how you're going to put together the story. You know, what part you're going to privilege, what you're not going to privilege. There's a lot that's true, but that doesn't make the story coherent. So it's your job in some ways to make the story coherent. So then you have to make the case for what's the purpose of me telling you the story? What is it going to do to you? What's it going to do to me?
I have something, but my brain's a little fuzzy, so I don't know how it's going to come out. So I never thought about Judaism as something where you are permitted to just sort of discard everything from the past, yeah, we symbolically throw away our sins, but we're still, like you said, we're still remembering them, we're still acknowledging them. So different from the idea of confession, right? I can do all these sins, but then I confess them, then I'm absolved of them. And so for me, like, I always distinguish between sort of that Christian idea of you know, absolving of my sins, confessing them, then I can move on, and Jesus is going to take them for me,
Right.
versus, you know, this is the whole of me,
Yeah.
and I move forward with my sins,
Right.
essentially.
I mean, I guess the difference in Judaism is we really have both. We definitely have the let's move on. We are throwing that bread into the ocean. You know, we're saying kol nidre. There's definitely that mood of moving on. But it's combined with this full naked standing in front of the mirror, the unatana tokef, that God remembers everything. That book is there. There's a book that's got all my misdeeds in it. I'm embarrassed by it. So you have both. I mean, there is this idea that you need both. You need the full accounting, and you need the renewal. And it's in fact up to you to synthesize those things. So have a good forgetting, have a good remembering. I'll tell you something I recently learned. One of the reasons that the rabbis give for dressing in white. So, you know, there's this tradition of dressing in white on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. So I learned all sorts of things about that. It symbolizes purity. There's also the idea that it symbolizes a shroud. The shroud is in white, so it symbolizes mortality. One idea is that white is where you can see the stains. There's no hiding. So, you know, why do I wear dark things so you can't see the stains? But if I'm wearing white, you can see the stains. So the stains have to be apparent, have to be manifest on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So that's, you know, the standing in front of the mirror, standing before God with everything. But, you know, the white can also mean a sense of triumph and purity and moving on. So even in your clothing, you know, you have both ideas. No wonder we're so confused. Yeah.
I think you did show a way to be an educator and a cheerleader. When you say, this is what we did, these are the mistakes we made, we know we made them, and now we're trying to be better. So then you are being both. You are
Right.
acknowledging and being and saying that, believe in us, because we're trying to make it better, and we're trying to improve things, even though we did this and this wrong, which we know we did.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting about that, which seems simple enough, is how controversial that is nowadays. I mean, just, yeah, you know, we're trying to do better, this is true, this is true. I mean, forces from both sides of the political spectrum will jump on you for that statement. You know, how dare you, you know, recognize, how dare you imply that the great Thomas Jefferson owned slaves? Or, you know, that's what you should start with that. Start with the fact that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, because that shows something deeply impure in our story. So the basic sort of Jewish story is that where we recognize the trauma, but in order to move on, that optimistic spirit, that's suddenly become very dangerous in our culture. And maybe, you know, part of what we're learning from this is that's our message. Judaism has a message about how to tell a story. It's a complicated message, you know, because it involves trying to move on, but it also involves facing the traumas of the past with a full mirror.
Deborah Pantoni has a question.
Okay?
Deborah, if you could try to unmute.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
My question is, so when we ask other people for forgiveness, okay, I've made a mistake. So don't I have to reckon with my mistake, admit my mistake, and then that's the only way I can make a turn to be better? If I don't reckon my mistake, then I can never really be better.
Yes. I mean, yeah. The thing is that I'm going to make it a little more complicated. So what happens after you do that? So you said you're sorry, and in order to become better, and let's say that the person even accepts your apology. What happens in your memory? So now you just move on. I moved on. I mean, that's a temptation. That's the Tashlik temptation.
No, but I also, Rabbi, I mean, you have to change too. You don't just admit your mistake. You must change, and then. Okay, I'm sorry.
So, you're right. So, but if the idea is I have to change, then you have to remember. I mean, the saying you're sorry is an attempt to forget and move on. But if you really want to change, then you've got to remember. So there's a sense of forgetting there and remembering, because there's some stuff in all those interactions that you have to forget. Forget the anger. Let's move past the anger. Let's move past the bitterness. But if you're really going to be a better person, that story still has to be there in that book, in the book that you're writing about your life. And that's what's hard. You know, when I was at the seminary, before Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, strangers would come up to me in the hall and say, please forgive me for anything terrible that I did. Because there was this kind of, and I said, I don't even know you. but there was this kind of, there was this kind of formulaic, you know, you have to go out and apologize to everybody so you can move on. And then, so the reason I resisted that is because, well, that's just mechanical. That's just throwing your bread in the ocean. It's not, you're not saying what you did to me. You're not even remembering anything you did to me. You just turned it into this sort of mechanical ritual. So all of these stories, I think, tell us that you really do need both. There's the full reckoning, so then you can move on, so you can change. So you remember so you can forget. Forget so you can remember. Yeah. Yes.
There's just something I've thought about, and this is how the media and video and tape plays into the idea, let's say, of apologizing, reckoning. Because a lot of times somebody, you know, is famous or in the news will do something wrong, or make a mistake, and they'll never say, I made a mistake, I did something wrong. And I've always felt they can't, because that clip will be played over and over for eternity, and that's all that will be portrayed about that person. And so they sort of know, or they cannot apologize. Or acknowledge even doing wrong.
I mean, that's
something I've known, and it's, I don't know.
Well, I'll say two things. Yeah, that's the difficulty of our culture, where memory can be eternal. Something you did when you were 5 years old could still be on a, you know, somewhere on the web when you're 95 years old. So there's the possibility of forgetting is really remote. At the same time, I mean, we have this idea in Nutana Tokef, which is an ancient prayer, that there's a book and everything's in the book. So the difference between now and then is that everything really is in the book. It's up there, it's in the cloud. But there was still this idea that everything I do matters. Everything I do ultimately is written in ink, it's sealed. So it's there, and the full reckoning is there. So yes, it's a challenge, particularly if you're a celebrity. Luckily, I'm not a celebrity, so I don't have to worry about it as much. I mean, for our own, this is luckily, but for our own interactions, it's the memory part is still really important.
I was just gonna say that I think that is why we need compassion for each other so much more now than any other time, right? Because we have to live with this collective memory that's always there, and we have to be willing to accept that happens in time, and that people grow and change, and be able to honor that. It's all the more important because of our culture right now.
Yeah, that's really good. I'll respond to that in a second, and that'll sort of be my closing comment.
I think there's a big difference between the individual nature of a mistake or forgiving versus collective guilt. And we in anti-Semitism face the problem of collective guilt all the time.
I mean, what's interesting is, can there be a response of forgiveness and mercy, even to collective guilt, to the idea of collective guilt? So, you know, we were a bigoted nation for a long time. And all of us were responsible and not responsible in the same way, but it's part of our history. Can we do tshuva? You know, can we repent that? Can we look at ourselves with a sense of compassion and not bitterness and hatred? You know, and then we can tell the stories. We can't tell the stories unless we have that sense of forgiveness and compassion. So I'm going to end with this. So there's another prayer. People at home, I'll read it. It's not very long. There's another. It's a prayer that it's the end of the Amidah. The big standing prayer in the Yom Kippur service. And in some ways, I feel like it's a response to the Unatana Tokef. The Unatana Tokef is that I'm standing before you, God, utterly naked. You can see everything. You can see all the stains. I'm remembering all my traumas, all my sins, all my mistakes. This is what we say after ending this long silent prayer. God, before I was formed, I was unworthy to be created. And now that I have been formed, it is as if I have not been formed. I am like dust while I live, and how much more so when I am dead. Here I am before you like a vessel filled with shame. This is really dramatic. I mean, if this were really in our prayer book, it is, but usually it's mistranslated because it's so stark. May it be your will, Adonai, my God and God of our fathers, that I shall sin no more. And the sins I've committed before you, cleanse them in your abundant mercies, but not through suffering and severe illness. So I deserve to be punished, but not severely. The last press release. I think so. Unataka says, we are so awful. We do so many terrible things. We made so many mistakes as a community, as individuals. Oh, I'm telling you that, God. But in this prayer, we're saying, of course, because we're so frail. To be human is to be frail. This prayer should awaken our sense of forgiveness and mercy and compassion. We can't help ourselves. All we're trying to do year after year is we're trying to be better, but we're going to fail even at that. But we're going to try. So you have this inner dialogue. One is that I need to say everything I did, and it has to be fully reckoned for. But at the same time, look, God, I'm only human. I'll try better next year. Let's move on. Okay, thank you very much. Shana Tova.